Hey, everybody, welcome to the discussion for chapter 3 of the story. Chapter 3 is entitled Joseph from Slave to Deputy Pharaoh. When we left off last week, as we were focusing in on the period of time and the individuals, sort of three generations known as the patriarchs, Jacob, who is the grandson of Abraham and the third patriarch, had established his family, benefiting from God's blessing upon him. Now, his family was very large. It included two wives, two concubines slash wives slash servants, whatever you want to call them, and 12 sons and many daughters. Now, between chapter 2 and chapter 3, where we were last week to where we are this week, we fast forwarded just a little bit within the overarching narrative of the book of Genesis. Really not very far. We skipped just a couple of chapters in there. Now, Jacob, also known as Israel, remember we talked about that last time, his favor was resting upon son number 11, known as Joseph. Now, Joseph is favored because of his association with Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. Rachel was his beloved wife, and she was barren for many years. So when she finally conceived, her first son was Joseph, and that's probably why Jacob favored him so much. He also has her younger son, Benjamin, who's Jacob's youngest child. Rachel actually died giving birth to Benjamin. So we'll hear about Benjamin a little bit later on in the chapter. He becomes important as the story goes on. So again, as what we have skipped over, we see Jacob's favor resting on Joseph, and he's given a lot of status within the family. Maybe you've heard of his coat of many colors. We actually don't really hear very much about that here in the story, but that's a big deal and really indicates his status. He's often kept back when the rest of the sons are sent out to do work. And that's really where we pick up. Joseph is also given the gift of divine dreams. He has a couple of different dreams that that really sort of indicate his future status. And being a typical boneheaded teenager, he's kind of arrogant about it. And this is why his older brothers really do not like him. They resent him big time, both because of the favor that Jacob shows him and because he's kind of mouthy about stuff. And this is where we really pick up. Now, most of the brothers actually seem to want him dead. And we hear that. Hey, let's kill this dreamer. It'll be great. But Reuben, who is actually the oldest brother, he recognizes that he will be held responsible and actually wants to save him. So that's why we get that little snippet of he intends to return him to his father. But Judah, who's the next oldest, he hatches the plan to make a buck by selling Joseph as a slave. So because of this early action, Joseph is hauled off into Egypt. And that's really where the bulk of this chapter lies. Now, we have three main aspects that I think really pop up through this chapter and through the story of Joseph in Egypt as a whole. We hear about God's favor and his repeated elevation, how things just continue to go well for him, and he continues to sort of build up over and over and over again. Then the next section that we have is his dealings with his brothers, which are kind of fun. He messes with them a fair amount. And then finally relocating his family from where they are up around the promised land to come down to Egypt. So those are sort of the three main things. Now, first off, let's think about his repeated elevation. The details each time, and I think it happens 3 times, they sort of seem to repeat over and over and over again. They're very, very similar, even though the situations are different, and a pattern really emerges. In everything that Joseph does, seemingly everything that he touches, everything he focuses on, God blesses it. And whichever master is present at each particular situation, the master recognizes this and then continues to give him more and more responsibility to ease his own situation. Now, first we see it with Potiphar. Potiphar is the captain of the Egyptian guard, so he's a very important person within Egypt. But first off, Joseph is a slave within his house, and God blesses everything. Potiphar elevates him to basically care for the entire house, and everything's great until Potiphar's wife accuses him of rape, and this lands him in prison. Then in prison, we see the same sort of situation where the head jailer recognizes, hey, this guy does well. I'm just going to put him in charge of everything, and everything in the jail is going on. Now, one thing that gets skipped over within our narration is the development of his ability for divination to really understand dreams, not just to have dreams, but to really understand them. In prison, he encounters two of Pharaoh's officials or people from within his court, interprets their dreams for him. One is favorable and one is not so favorable. And the one that's favorable, who he says, you're going to be restored, and then it happens, he says, just remember me when you are restored into the court. But the guy forgets about him for a couple of years. So Joseph just continues to hang out for a couple of years in prison. But finally, then Pharaoh has some dreams, which we learn are divinely inspired from God. And then the one guy remembers, oh, hey, I met this guy in prison who can interpret dreams. His name is Joseph. So they bring Joseph out. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams about the coming years of plenty that will be followed by the years of famine. And he devises this plan. He says, here's what you should do, Pharaoh. Here's how you can benefit from this and take care of your people. And not only take care of your people, but elevate yourself and grow your riches and fame and everything. And Pharaoh's like, that sounds really good. We need someone to do that. Hey, Joseph, you do it. And we see that Joseph now becomes second in command to all of Egypt. He's basically like vice Pharaoh, if that's a thing. And all of this that we see happens. And under his guidance, Pharaoh's status and wisdom and riches and lands and all of this continues to increase because of the benefit of what Joseph has done. Now, that's his repeated elevation all the way up to second in command in Egypt. And now, after some years go by, the years of plenty have happened, and we're a year or two into the famine, and now Joseph's family, or the family of Jacob, perhaps we should say, needs food. So Jacob sends the oldest 10 brothers to go and buy food. Of course, he thinks Joseph is dead at this point, and Benjamin, the youngest son, he holds him back because he's also now favored. While it doesn't come out and say it directly, I oftentimes wonder if Joseph's action as he deals with his brothers over and over and over again might just serve as a little bit of payback for what they had done. We don't know that for a fact, and maybe that's just me being a little snarky or cynical, but it sort of seems like it just feels like messing with them just a little bit. But ultimately, he is trying to get the entire family, not just the brothers, but the entirety of Jacob's family to come and join him and benefit from his status there. And then we do see that. Finally, Jacob brings the entire household to Egypt when he learns that Joseph is still alive and Joseph is basically in command there. They're all treated very favorably because of Joseph and because of Joseph's status. And this is where we see the basis for what this family, and it's a big family, but this family begin to expand out over the course of the next 400 years into a culture. So that is really what's going on there. Now, some takeaway. That was kind of all the high points that I thought were really, really important to remember. Now, the takeaway. Here's just a little bit of background that I think is important to think about. Now, a lot of biblical scholars believe that Exodus was really the first book that was established within the Hebrew scriptures, or what we call the Old Testament. And it really begins, if you know what Exodus is, it begins with Moses, and the people are enslaved at this point. And this is the great deliverance of God, of the people out of Egypt. Side note, that's next week. So, be ready for chapter 4. But in a lot of ways, it is thought that the Jewish culture, or the Hebrew culture, really began in Egypt as the family expanded to become the culture over the course of this 400 years. Now, some scholars have proposed the possibility that the various stories that we find in Genesis that we've looked at, as well as the ones that we've glossed over, that were passed down, oral tradition, passed down from generation to generation. Some scholars have proposed that Genesis was eventually recorded as an answer to the question of how did we find ourselves in Egypt to begin with. So if their history begins or starts, or their culture begins or starts as slaves in Egypt, when they ask the question, well, how do we get there in the first place? That seems to be the general question that's answered through the book of through the book of Genesis, which I really, really like. It's like, okay, so the earth began somehow, God made it somehow, and people began, and things got all messed up, and gradually, we moved through this long period of history to find ourselves as a culture in Egypt, and that's where things will pick up next week.